It seems that our viewers didn't hate me in the co-host chair with you, so we're running it back, baby. Let's do it. Let's
Yeah,
get into it.
let's do it. Let's do it.
Okay, so I think that like let's just start with the big question, which is what makes software development riskier when you are a non-software company versus a company who might be a SaaS company or their primary product is software.
What's funny, Andrew, is I don't know that the problems are different. They're just more prevalent or more exaggerated because people involved with the development effort may not have built a lot of software products before. And so the risk that I see show up a lot or the problems that I show up and the root causes, I think are really the same. So the biggest one is building before you really truly have clarity on what you're building and why you're building it. And, that's something we spend a lot of time talking about, exhaustively because it's such a huge problem. Like you can solve so many future issues by just being super clear on a handful of really important things. And amazingly enough, so many people are not clear on that. And it's more of a risk when you're a non-software company because you don't know what you don't know, right? And so you haven't faced those problems before. You may not even appreciate the value of clarity until you're sort of knee deep in a project that's on fire.
That's exactly where you want to land, right? Knee deep in a project that's on fire.
That's right. That's right.
Do you find that the failure rate for software projects or software initiatives or even like just digital product initiatives, is the failure rate higher for mid-market non-software companies than it is for software companies, or does the failure just kind of look different?
My suspicion is that the failure rate is probably pretty similar, but the consequences of the failure is greater because in a mid-market company, you're typically tackling something a little bit larger scale, more complex, more opportunities for risk to show up and, just more burned budget, more burned time, more burned opportunities because something fails or doesn't launch on time, that kind of thing. So I think the failure rate I would imagine it's probably pretty similar, but the consequence of a failure is much worse.
It would seem to me that for a mid-market company, a lot of times when they are wading into the waters of custom software development, it's oftentimes to enhance or replace an older manual process, but it is truly a business critical process or workflow to what it is that they're doing. Whereas
Right.
a lot of times, at least in my anecdotal evidence, when a software company or a SaaS company is building out either a new feature or a new product, oftentimes it is a new to market offering.
Yeah.
So it's not automatically like mission critical that they nail it on the first go. Whereas if you're a mid-market company and you're moving like a core piece of your product offering or workflow onto a new tool, if you screw it up, it could be disastrous. Is that kind of what you're talking about in terms of like the risk of failure?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think so if you take an early stage startup, they have no customers, no users, they're building a product from scratch and they're going to be a software company and they're going to launch it. Nobody wants to fail in that launch, right? And there's certainly consequences to failing at that effort. But if you compare that to being an existing company, you're doing millions of dollars in revenue, and you roll out something that fails, all the different consequences that come along with that, like unhappy customers, deliveries don't go out, a user experience is poor, it could stop the revenue like stream, in extreme cases. It can wreak havoc in lots of different ways across the business. And so the way you have to approach it is quite different than if you're a startup sort of stepping towards, incremental validation of launching a product. You really have to make sure you get it right. And you have to put a lot more thought into sort of what is your plan for launching this, rollback strategy, monitoring, what's your testing plan. Those kinds of things become even more important in a launch like that, where you're going to impact real users from the moment you go live versus a startup where you get an opportunity to kind of launch something, start to accumulate users and kind of grow from there. So it's definitely a different ball game.
From where you sit as a strategic partner to both software companies, SaaS companies, as well as mid-market leaders in their respective fields, when a company in those two buckets is looking to spin up and launch a digital product, what are the support differences between those two types of engagements from where you guys sit?
If we compare a startup company to a mid-market company that's not a software company, in both cases, they don't sort of have the full product team that you need to really do this well in most cases. I'm talking, product designers, solution architect, these different elements that you really need to be able to design a good product. However, in more of a scenario where you have a mid-market company, it's pretty common that they would have at least some technical representative that has some experience and expertise. So that might be a CIO or a director of IT or something like that, where they're at least familiar with a lot of the concepts. So along with that, often there's already a built-in appreciation for the importance of clarity before building. And so the education lift of kind of educating the customer on what they don't know and why it's important to them is a little bit easier a lot of times with the mid-market companies than maybe with a software company where you're dealing with a founder that has never built or been around custom development before.
When you look at more established software companies, SaaS companies that do have a core product in the marketplace, but they want to either add a really important feature or maybe broaden their product offering and bring a new digital product to market, what does the support needs look like for that company versus a company who is a mid-market leader in their respective space, but don't really have staff engineers, staff developers, that kind of stuff?
Yeah. So I think you're kind of referring to more of like a growth stage, like SaaS company as an example. And so, their needs are much different than sort of the two examples we've talked about, in that they typically do have a team and it's a product team. So they're working on and furthering a product. So they typically will have a lot of developers. They probably will have some sort of VP of engineering or someone who's ahead of the development effort, probably a QA team as part of their in-house team. A hole that I see a lot with growth stage companies is they don't have sort of that design owner, like more of the product designer that is more than a visual designer. I'm talking about really a UX or a person who's really thinking the product design strategy and the user journey, that kind of thing. Sometimes they'll have those. But even when they have those resources, they haven't repeated the process of going through that sort of clarifying stage again, right? So some of them are probably familiar with concepts that we use in our innovation lab, like design thinking and sort of how that can efficiently speed you through the process and get you to, a good spot where you can build something, and have a plan around it. Or what I see a lot of times is these growth stage companies, they're working really hard. But they're working on what's in front of them right now. They're sort of working one sprint at a time. And what's really valuable a lot of times is to have a third party or an outside view of looking at this kind of with fresh eyes and then really pulling together a plan. Because a lot of times what will happen is this team who's competent and they're doing good work, they're working really hard, and maybe they're shipping features or they're really advancing the product, but they're doing it with a very near-term view. And it's sort of the, you've heard the adage of a frog in a pot of boiling water, right? They look up and they're like, well, one, we don't know where we're going. We don't have a clear roadmap. We don't have a clear direction on how we're progressing against that roadmap, but we're not also able to make clear decisions about how much are we investing in this initiative? How long is it going to take us to get there? And sort of what's the planning around that? And so that's one element. There's still the strategy piece there where I think growth stage companies who have in-house product teams really need that help. The other part of it is if they are clear on it, a lot of times they really want to get from point A to point B as quickly as they can. And that may not be possible to do in a short amount of time with an in-house team only. And so a lot of times the way that we'll work with those types of folks is sort of as a team extension where we may help with the strategy and planning stuff, but then when we get to executing, we bring our team alongside their in-house team to add additional bandwidth and help get them there faster. And it could be just co-developing things together, working collaboratively on the same effort, or sometimes it's carve-outs on certain feature sets or focusing on a particular platform or some element of the initiative.
And then contrast that with if you are meeting with a mid-market leader in their space for the first time and they're thinking that maybe a piece of custom software, a custom software solution is going to speed up their growth, reach new customers, whatever. Yeah. What does that engagement look like when you're meeting with a mid-market company versus more of a growth stage software company that does have some level of in-house expertise and bandwidth? Yeah. They just might need to supercharge that a little bit versus a company that really doesn't have that level of fluency in digital product design and development.
Yeah, there's some subtle differences there. I think with the mid-market example, they're looking for more of a turnkey solution to executing on it. So they're a little more open about the process and the various resources that might be involved and that kind of thing. With the growth stage company example, they sometimes come to that conversation with a very narrow need. So it's pretty common that those types of clients show up to us, not really seeing the value or asking initially for sort of the broader strategy and planning piece, but it's very specific. Like we need an architectural review, or we need a user experience review. And so it's these kind of very specific things, and that sometimes that's how we start off working together. It's a very specific, narrow, kind of surgical need. But then once we're there, we find that there's an opportunity. Okay, we can help take a lot of risk off the table by broadening this a little bit as a follow-on stage to help plug a lot of the other holes that we see when we're working on sort of that narrow focus to begin with.
One of the things that I found interesting when we were talking about this, before we were on the air, as it were, was that most mid-market companies do have some digital motion of some kind, right? Whether that is a director of IT, maybe they have a CIO, CTO, they might have a cybersecurity, head or, person tasked to that. But one of the things you said to me is that when they're thinking about developing a new software solution, it's really hard to move from the IT motion of keep lights on, keep servers up, keep downtime to a minimum, versus the mindset that is we are trying to build a new product that will innovate, drive growth, drive results. Can you talk to me a little bit about the mindset difference between the in-house IT department of a mid-market company versus what might be necessary to bring a new digital product to market on their behalf?
Yeah, sure. I think from what I've seen, it's really common that, if let's say we're dealing with a CIO at a mid-sized company, they're wearing a lot of hats, and product development usually isn't the biggest focus that they have. I mean, they're covering a lot of ground that's things that aren't really custom software related. We're talking just network and infrastructure and phones and internet and things that are just operational necessities to kind of keep things moving along. Making sure that they're educating their workforce on cybersecurity issues and how to spot phishing, and they're covering a whole lot of ground, right? And so product development is much different than sort of general IT support. And so now a lot of them have done a fair amount of custom development. Oftentimes that comes in the form of really like systems integration. So we're trying to link together a bunch of different systems and create some sort of efficiencies or workflow. But when we come to the table, we're really looking at this as a product and as a total user experience, which certainly will cover integrations, but bringing a perspective of the user to the forefront and focusing on what are sort of the business results that we're trying to drive. It helps kind of back up and look at this and plan a real product or a real experience. And then we figure out how to execute the technical elements that a lot of people sort of gravitate towards instead of more of the strategy.
I think the analogy that I really like for this comes from Formula One, right? Where an IT department is a lot like your pit crew for a Formula One race, where it's like you need them to be on their game or you will lose races, right? Like the car comes in, you got to get new tires. Like it's got to be quick. It's got to be right on the money every single time. Like that's keeping the lights on kind of stuff. Whereas a product motion is much more like the 1,000 design engineers back at Mercedes headquarters who are like trying to figure out the perfect aerodynamic shell and the drag and the downforce and all these kind of things where you need both of them to be a successful company, to be sure. It's just that they are very different mindsets, but they're both racing a car, right? It's just one's more of like design engineering and the other's like, we got to keep this thing humming as fast as it can once like the rubber hits the road.
Yeah. I think that's a fair analogy. And one other element that I'll mention is as you get larger as a company, this sort of concept of shadow IT starts to show up, where different department heads are sort of operating more in isolation. So they're making decisions about, we're going to do this, sometimes even engaging companies to build something, that they need or that they want, or buying some sort of software product that they want to incorporate. And I think one of the things that I've seen us really be able to help is to avoid that type of scenario by really aligning stakeholders very early on. So when you're looking at things more from a business objective and a planning standpoint, part of that process is you have to get the right stakeholders into the conversation. And one of the biggest killers of custom dev projects is a misalignment of expectations among the various stakeholders. So I've seen before where, a CIO gets a request from like a head of sales and, customer support team, for example, and they're not on the same page in terms of what exactly the ask is and what will success look like from the beginning. And quite frankly, the IT team gets thrown under the bus a lot, right? Because when sales doesn't get what they need for providing something to their customer, then it's easy to blame, well, IT messed this up, right? And so we really don't want that to happen. And one of the best antidotes to that situation is to, from the very beginning, make sure you've got the key stakeholders in the conversation. They're aligned and they're all on the same page and clear about what are we actually doing here and what is the definition of done.
So when you are talking to a mid-market company who is interested or moving toward building a custom digital product of some kind, what do you see as the biggest risk factors that they are likely to encounter, as well as how do you guide them, or what advice would you give them on how to make what is inherently a risky undertaking a lot less risky?
Yeah, there's a few. One of them is not different from lots of other scenarios, but not being really clear about defining success before you start. So why are we doing this? What would it look like if we were successful? Being very clear on that part. And then that leads into the other big risk that I see a lot is mid-market companies are much more prone to misalignment on stakeholders. So people from different departments that all have a role to play in the effort, not being on the same page about what the solution is going to look like and what success looks like and what is maybe going to be in the sort of first version or iteration of this versus something that's maybe future roadmap or vision. Those things wreak havoc on these types of projects because you're dealing with people, and when there's this misalignment, then finger pointing starts coming into play. People are unhappy. People get fired. I mean, you start to see a lot of that kind of stuff in those kinds of scenarios, especially if projects aren't going well, or if they're burning through budget, or they're over budget, or something's delayed, that kind of thing. So those are two that come to mind. Another one that I think that is maybe a little bit more unique to mid-market versus like a software product company, either early stage or growth stage, is that being really clear on your approach to how you're building when it comes to build versus buy is something that I've seen cause a lot of problems. I'll give you an example. So we worked with a client years ago. We kind of came in a little bit late after the effort had already kind of started, and an underlying backbone of the entire process depended on this one sort of system that they bought from another company. And there was an approach that was chosen, that there was certain types of customization that they could do on their web application and their user experience that they could make the solution work. And they plowed ahead with that approach for a very long time, burned a lot of budget trying to make that work. And ultimately, the decision had to be made that that whole approach was flawed. We have to throw away what we tried to do, and we have to go at this a completely different way. And when you're in a big organization, it's very hard for somebody to step out there and make a call like that, again, because that's the kind of thing that people get fired for a lot of times, right? Is you burn $1 million on an effort that was ultimately flawed from the very beginning. That's very tough to explain, right? And so build versus buy, key dependencies on integration capabilities, things like that. Those are the types of things that people sort of take for granted, and they dive into something assuming that it's possible or it won't be a problem. And the project looks like it's going really good until you get to about 80 or 90% done, and you start demoing stuff and you start exposing gaps. And then all of a sudden, that's where you find the really tricky problems. And so I think the importance of being able to de-risk that is there. And in order to do that, you have to sort of figure out what are these sort of key assumptions at the very beginning. And then we validate that stuff before we get too deep into it. So if we find that there's going to be a brick wall at some point along the road, we'd rather figure out that brick wall when we're, at the very beginning of the project, rather than when we think that we're at the very end.
And then, from a mindset standpoint, an approach standpoint, maybe a partner standpoint, what would you say to a mid-market company looking to undergo a digital product build or an innovation cycle, what have you? What would you say to them would be your top few pieces of advice to make that process, that prospect, less risky?
Sort of tackling the human element of project failure, I think, is a good approach. And what I mean by that is enrolling people in the why are we doing this? Like some of these projects are big, they'll take some time, they take a pretty good investment, they take from other potential opportunities that you could pursue with the same resources and attention. And so it's important to be clear on the why are we doing this and what's the expected impact on the business. And then take that the next step and enroll everybody else that's involved in that objective, so that if you do hit snags, or there's attention or money or resources needed, people are reminded of why did we start this in the first place? And that's also a good opportunity to really challenge the business case, right? So if you're trying to identify that why, and you're having trouble getting people on board with that uniformly across the organization, maybe that's an indicator that this shouldn't be something that we spend our attention on.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things that it might be a nice thought or a nice feature, but if you're saving your team like an hour a week, but it's going to cost you $500,000 to build that feature, it's like, yeah, it's a little bit inconvenient, but keep
Right.
the process manual. It's not worth it enough to solve that problem with a custom software solution.
Right.
versus a different situation where it's like, well, this could 3x our business if we nail this. It's like, okay, well, that's a big enough problem that it's
Yeah.
worth going down the road of custom software development.
Exactly. And if you can get everybody enrolled in that, then everybody owns the decision, right? So we're in it together.
And everybody's, everybody's yoked to the same sled where they're trying
That's
to
right.
like, everybody wants to pull it forward together.
Yeah,
Everybody's
that's right.
invested in success.
And I've mentioned it a little bit, as we're talking through this. I think one unique element for mid-sized companies is there's this sort of political element to it a lot of times, right? When something goes well, right, people don't really pay attention to it too much. But if an effort goes off the rails, people start looking for who to blame. And so I think, especially if I'm talking to CIOs, this is a great investment for them to enroll those stakeholders and make sure that they're sort of owning that this is the priority. This is what we need to be spending on. And more importantly, we have good data that tells us what this is going to look like in terms of investment and time and that kind of thing.
Can you walk me through some examples of clients that you've worked with that were mid-market companies, mid-market leaders in their space, where they came to you with a problem or something that they wanted to solve for, and what that looked like from your end and how you helped them achieve what it is that they were trying to achieve?
Yeah. I'll give kind of two flavors of examples. One's a large healthcare system. It's pretty well known here in Dallas. And, they did not have a product team in-house. They did have an IT team. They had a CIO and a CISO and several other people. They even had, I think, an innovation manager. And part of their challenge was that they would get these requests or ideas across the organization sent to them and are like, hey, we should do this, right? But they're not equipped to be able to really efficiently sort of vet those concepts and provide recommendations on, should we do this or not? And so we did a lot of our innovation labs for them over the years where they would have these ideas that got brought to them from executives, and they came to us and said, hey, we want to put this through a lab. And I remember, one of the comments that I appreciated the most from their head of innovation was, I love doing this process with you guys because, 4 to 6 weeks going through this, I end up with this deck that I can turn around and go to a board meeting with and walk them through the presentation. It gives terrific visuals on exactly what is this going to look. I know the budget is bankable and we can rely on that number, and it creates a clear picture of what this is going to do. And a lot of those that we did with them, they decided not to move forward on, which in my book is still success. Maybe they invested in the lab and they didn't move forward on the product, but they probably saved themselves a whole lot of money in the long term. But what happens a lot of times in organizations is these concepts and ideas sort of just float around, and people get frustrated because they're like, well, nothing's happened with this. And so this approach of having, a partner that is equipped with the people and the process to sort of execute that in a defined time box it shifts the accountability so it actually gets done. And then you have sort of a up or out decision. We're either going to move forward on this, move forward, or we're not, and it's off our radar, right? And we're not thinking about it anymore. So that's one example that's purely more the design and define and sort of strategy piece.
Well, I think in that kind of scenario too, it's one of those things where people don't want to feel like, especially if they are an executive, they have a level of cachet within the organization that I came to you with an idea and you're just telling me we can't do it, and there's
Totally.
no why,
Yeah.
It's fine if it's not doable. It's fine if it's not the right strategic decision, but I need to hear a why so that I feel like that I'm being heard, I'm being valued.
Yeah.
Because it might be a decent enough idea, but it's going to cost $5 million to build the solution that you want. We just straight up don't have that money, or
Right.
it's like,
Or there's
you're
no
thinking
ROI,
Yeah, or whatever it might be. And so I think that, to your point, even in situations where it's not the up but rather the out, at least those executives still feel heard, valued, and it's like, listen, we put it through a rigorous testing process, iteration process, and it's not going to work for this, and this reasons. And then there's a lot more clarity, and like you said, there isn't this kind of soup of ill-defined ideas just kind of floating around within the organization. It is much more tailored, defined, and like you get to yes or no decisions. And one of the other things that I think is worth mentioning here is that one of the things I keep finding in all my walks of life, regardless of what it is I'm making purchasing decisions on, is that so much value is in information asymmetry. I don't know how much it costs to like retile a floor or a kitchen, right? I don't know how much this thing costs, how many hours that thing costs, whatever. And so the person with the information corners the market, right?
Yeah.
And I think a huge part of what the Innovation Lab allows you to do is that, these are in theory potentially really good ideas, but there's a huge information asymmetry of like, decent idea in theory, here's what it actually takes to get there. Versus, I think a lot of other partners would come in and be like, we can build that for you. It's going to cost $1.5 million. Like, we'll have it for you in 6 months, whatever it is. But they're not asking the why. What is it going to take to do it? What is it going to take to scale that? There's a huge information asymmetry, especially in mid-market companies that don't have that in-house product team, that in-house, development muscle memory that you can bridge that gap of the information asymmetry.
The speed of it is really valuable, I think, right? Like getting to a no is just as important as getting to a yes, especially if you can get there quickly and in a way that you can trust the process, right? So I think back to, an executive knowing that they got heard with an idea, how much better is it if the executive knows that it got like appropriate attention and review, and it was done consistently with how they've seen it in the past. And I think one of the cool scenarios that I've seen show up is clients will sort of lean on us as almost an outsourced R&D team, where they're like, hey, we think there's opportunity here. We think we can drive cost reductions or speed up a process or enhance a user experience or whatever. And again, they may not have the internal bandwidth to go, okay, we're going to go spend several weeks on, really fleshing this out and deciding. So again, it just kind of floats around in the background, and then all these ideas sort of stack up and it's just noise. I think what's nice about like kind of how we fit in with these size companies is they want to drive innovation. They want to have faith that assessing these is being done in sort of a structured, repeatable, consistent fashion. And so we sort of turn into that answer for them, where this is the pipeline of things that we're considering. We've narrowed this down. We want to put this one through the lab and come back with it and decide whether it gets a green light or not. And I think that, because maybe at enterprise level, they've got a lot of that capability in house, but the mid-market, that's something that's hard to keep the right combination of resources there. And so, it's a nice fit because it's there when you need it. It's real quick. It's accountable to somebody else, and then you move on.
Are there any other examples of mid-market companies that you've worked with that have gone kind of soup to nuts from, we have an idea, let's vet it out, let's prove the business case, do the innovation lab, and then you guys actually helped them with the execution and building of what the solution or the product ended up being?
Yeah, I mean, one example I can think of is we had happened to be another healthcare client, but they got a large investment from a private equity firm, and so there was a real aggressive push on firming up their product in lots of different ways. And they're kind of an example we talked about a little bit earlier in the episode about that these mid-market companies, a lot of times they end up coming to us for something very specific, and then it broadens out a little bit. And in this case, they had this big initiative that already in their mind, but the element that sort of triggered them to get in touch with us was that their sort of patient intake or onboarding experience was really bad in their opinion, and they're like, we need to fix that user experience, right? Well, yeah, think about, I know every time I fill out forms at our doctor's office, I'm reminded of how widespread that kind of problem is. But that was the original ask, and so our innovation lab in that case was very focused on this particular user experience. So it's a little bit more of a surgical approach to a problem. And that that engagement showed so much value, and this was something that was being reviewed at the board level for this company because it was very important to them moving the product to where it needed to be. So we got that exposure there where it's like, wow, this really solves a big problem, helps our product. But then as they started to turn towards more technical challenges, so they had to start reviewing the architecture and decide, hey, is this architecture really going to carry us to the growth that we're projecting? And they knew that was another problem that had to be. So that sort of opened the door to like another flavor of an innovation lab. So we ended up doing 2 or 3 of those for those guys focused on these more specific areas of need. Where they had gaps in their team and they needed something sort of done well pretty quickly. And then ultimately, as they got into this sort of full-blown rebuild effort, then they pulled us in to help with a extended team to add a lot of capacity and move that roadmap forward.
Developing custom software for a mid-market company is a risky business inherently. It takes a long time, usually costs a lot of money. The stakes are pretty high. What would you say to the CEOs, the CIOs, the CTOs who are in the decision-making chair on whether to move forward with a custom software project, what that might look like, the flavor it might take? What would you say to them in terms of how do you set yourself up for the best chance of success and limit your downside risk?
Yeah, it's sort of that adage of measure twice, cut once kind of thing. Like don't get into a commitment on an initiative until you really feel comfortable that you've got the important questions answered. And I probably sound like a broken record, but you gotta, that is a part of the process. But the next piece is that everybody else has to be on the same page. That a lot of CIOs out there that are friends of mine, that's one of the most frustrating positions to be in is, these initiatives, if they don't go well, nobody cares why. They're just looking at the person who is supposedly leading the effort. And so, set yourself up for success. It's better to hold off on diving in, that tendency to start putting developers on something and start whipping something together. Instead of that, think like a startup, proof of concept something, maybe pilot something, get that stakeholder alignment, get that clarity, still try to get validation, like thinking like a startup, you have to think about, the concept of validation gates that we've talked a lot about in the past, of being really clear on what's the sort of minimum step that we can take to get maximum validation. And every time you pass through one of those validation gates, you're taking a lot of risk off the table. So I would recommend, don't shy away from thinking like a startup when you're approaching these initiatives internally.
Yeah, I think it's the old adage I used to talk about when I worked in sales before I moved on to some other endeavors. I used to have a boss, and he literally said to me, like, I don't want to hear about the labor, just show me the baby. Right? I don't want to hear about all the reasons why like this meeting fell through or that contract. Like, I don't care. Just show me the results, right? And like, I found that to be very frustrating at the time because I'm like, well, here's what the context of what's happening. He's like, I don't care. I do not care about the labor. Just show me the baby. And I think that when it comes to big software initiatives that the CIO or the CTO is overseeing, if you don't have full buy-in every step along the way from every stakeholder that cares about that or could potentially be impacted by that, you're going to get I don't really care why it failed. It failed.
Totally.
Like, that's it. Like we're done here. Yeah.
And I've seen that example, especially when people aren't as knowledgeable about, the technical elements of this. Like in one of the clients I mentioned earlier, they had this VP of sales that wanted this thing for the customers, right? And you had a CIO that was trying to execute on that. And the CIO is trying to explain to them deep into this project what the problem is or what the limitations are. And they literally don't care. One, I don't understand it. And two, I don't care. I just want to I've already promised this to my customer and they're waiting on it. And so the reason doesn't matter. And so I think that personally from a CIO standpoint, it is good for you in your role to remain that sort of trusted technical voice to make sure that you really take that risk off really early on behind the scenes, so that it doesn't show up in those conversations later that you just get the glossy eyes from the rest of the room on.
I can't imagine a salesperson promising something to a customer
Never
without first
Right.
talking
Never
to their
happened before.
their engineering and tech
Never
team
happened before.
first.
Or get excited about screenshots and tell them it's already developed.
It's ready to
right?
go.
So-
Well, you'll have that in 2 weeks. Your development
right.
team's like, wait, what?
That's right. Yeah.
All right.
exactly.
Well, good talking as always, my friend, and I'll see you again next month.
Absolutely. Thanks, Andrew.